The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. We got 1 minute or a little bit less than 1 minute. I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera on. And I hate doing that, but that way you can see who is talking to you. There I am. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the session today. This is one of my favorite sessions. It has to do with one of my very favorite pieces of software of all times, and that's Excel. And a lot of people really need some help and some guidance in getting that Excel going. So let's go ahead and start digging in. This session is PivotTables 101. And this is our agenda for today. And if you're new to PivotTables, this is the perfect session for you. If you've used them some in the past, I've got some really cool things at the end I'm going to be showing that I absolutely love and can really make a big impact on your Excel pivot table. So our agenda today is why pivot tables in the first place. Oh, components of pivot table. I forgot I have a co-presenter with me too. I'll introduce him in just a moment. The components of the pivot table, so what makes up a pivot table and how those would use our work. I'm going to give you a secret to building pivot tables faster, basically any report faster. And the data we're going to use, we're going to focus on payables data using GP. Now, if you don't use GP, that's okay. If you don't use payables, that's okay too. I picked payables because every business has bills to pay. And so we're going to just kind of approach the same concept from two different areas of GP. But again, if you're not a GP user, that's quite all right. Then at the end, as I mentioned, I have a few pivot table secrets that I'm excited to share. And we're going to end with some Q&A time, although my co-presenter with me today is here to help me manage the queues during the session, so we could start asking them right away. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or the questions. And I was having a hard time answering one of the questions or comments in one of the questions below. So Denise, I see you, and I finally no longer have blue M&Ms, but thank you anyhow. For everyone else on the call, Denise and Denise Hartley from Oklahoma was the brainchild of sending me very special Power BI M&Ms with my picture on them after Summit, and I absolutely loved it. I made them stretch till Christmas. So anyhow, that's a side note. So everybody meet Brandon, my teammate. Hey, Brandon.
Hi, everybody. How's it going?
So he's the one that's going to be reading your questions if you have them and interrupting me. So that way I don't have to pay attention to looking over at my screen on my right. So here we go. And if I lose track, he'll call me and browbeat me to get back on track. This would not be an Ingevity webinar if we did not talk about our mission statement. We at Ingevity believe our mission statement wholeheartedly all the time. As a matter of fact, Brandon, I'm going to put you on the spot because he's relatively new to our company, and he could cheat because it's right on the screen. And we get asked, we had a big team meeting on Monday, and we were asked very first thing by our leader, Chris Dobkins, what's the mission statement? And several people quoted it at the same time. So Brandon, why don't you read our mission statement for us?
Sure. It's to improve the life and success of our partners and customers by providing exceptional business application experiences that simplify, inform, and delight.
Woohoo! And that's what we hope to do today. We hope to inform you and simplify the whole pivot table process. And I have no doubt you'll be delighted by the results as you go through. A little bit of housekeeping. I am using data from GP 2018 R2, but it doesn't matter what data you're using. And I'm using the most recent Excel from Office 365. So my Excel might look a little bit different than yours, but what I'm going to show you is in all the versions of Excel. And if it's not, then I will mention it. I should say all the versions since at least 2010. So let's just stick with 2010 and higher. All right. First thing, I have a poll question for you. My first question, I just want to know a little bit about you guys. So if you would answer the question you see, and that question is, oh, wrong screen. I pulled up the wrong thing, didn't I? Let me try it again. Oh, got to launch it. There we go. All right, now you can see the full question. I want to know if you guys use pivot tables now. So, all right, cool. Excellent. All right, so this is exciting. The bulk of you are in the yes, but I struggle with them, so that makes me really happy. I got a few rock stars and a couple people that don't use them yet. Don't worry, you're not going to be left behind. We're going to start at the very basic, work our way through, spend a lot of time in the middle, and then at the end, for those of you who rock it, then you're going to be super excited at the end. So that's the last poll question I have until the end. So let's go ahead and just spend a little bit of time on the slide deck. And I want to talk about why pivot tables. So imagine that you're at a meeting and you're asked to bring in a list of all your vendors and what they've billed you. So you bring in this report and you're all happy. And during the meeting, they say, oh, can you separate it out by years? So you run back and you separate it out by years and you come back to the meeting and they go, oh, well, we want it subtotaled by the state the vendor comes from. So you run back to your desk and you subtotal it by the state the vendor comes from and you go back and then they say, oh, we really only meant the bills that aren't paid. We didn't want everything. So you go back to your desk, and now you've got 4 separate reports that you built. You probably missed the whole meeting. So what are you going to do next time? Are you going to show up with these 4 reports? And probably so, right? So you could be prepared. But if you had 16 versions of these same reports, you're probably going to be asked for 16 more when you go back. So with a pivot table, you could have one file. And while you're there, you can slice and dice and make a whole lot of versions of the reports, add charts, and you could do it faster. And all the reports are super interactive, and that is incredibly powerful. You're going to be able to get more information quicker. And you want to use a pivot table when you expect that you're going to have variations in analysis. So there are some reports like SSRS, which I love, that are going to be static. So it's going to be difficult to change on the fly. But this is something where if you're asked to quickly pivot something or change, I don't want to look at payables by vendor. I want to look at them by an account they were coded to, or I want to look at them by for things that just happen in the month of May for every year. Then those are some things you could do very quickly, and you could quickly find trends in this kind of data. Now, of course, you could do this with Power BI as well, and you guys know I have to mention Power BI because I love Power BI. But Excel pivot tables are very easy. Almost everybody has Excel on their desk. And one of the things I love about Excel is it seems that everybody who knows how to file save thinks they're Excel expert and they're comfortable in Excel. I can't tell you how many times I've leaned over somebody's desk in GP and I start doing something super simple and they jump up and they go, you do it, you do it. Where in Excel, I could do something fairly complicated and they're like, ooh, show me how to do that. So this is something that's easy in Excel that can give you a lot of bang for your buck. So let's talk about what makes up a pivot table. What are the components? And somehow I went the wrong way on my slides. Okay, or I had 2 extra slides in there. Sorry about that. There are 4 components of a pivot table. There are rows, there are values, there are columns, and there are filters. And the only 2 that are absolutely required are the rows and the values. So you could build a very nice report with a pivot table just using rows and values. So that goes back to that first report that we talked about at the meeting. You bring in a list of all your vendors. And if you see me looking to the left, that's where my shared screen is. A list of all the vendors and their balances. And the vendor name is the rows. So that is the rows. The values are the amount you bill, the document amounts. Those are the 2 that are required. Now, you could just put a list of rows, but then you're just going to have a list of vendors. It doesn't really mean anything. Or you could put a value, and there's not a whole lot of meaning in a value if you don't break it down in some way. Like maybe you'd see the total of everything billed to AP, but you wouldn't really see, you wouldn't applies. Okay, and I'm going to click on next. I think we have a problem with our audio. So can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Oh, you're seeing me and not slides. Okay, that is me in slides, it's just because of the way your resolution probably is. So this will be a little bit better. I'll pop back on in a bit. All too happy. Now I can. Now, if you add this report, I added in the years as columns. So the years represent what the columns are, and the values will break down into each column based on those component of the film as posted or not. And so also in this example, you could also see the states were added in. So let's take a look at how the components are on this exact same report. So you see in the, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. Well, I'll wait to zoom in. In the orange in the top left, in row 1, status, whether I want posted or all transactions, including unposted, that is our filter. The blue area, those are our rows. In our rows, we have vendor names, and we happen to have states as well. In the green on the right, those are our columns where we said, all right, put a year in each column. And in the yellow underneath that, those are our values. Now, I left off the total because the total it's kind of values in columns, but it's something you can turn on or off. And these are how our components lay out on the report. And when you go to build a pivot table, they're going to lay out in exactly the same way. So when you go into Excel to build something out, on the left, you're going to see your canvas where it says Pivot Table 1. And the purple areas are pointing to those 4 components. And they're laid out exactly as they were on the previous screen, with filters in the top left, column in the top right, rows in the bottom left, values in the bottom right. That sounded like I was rapping a little bit there in my head. And you can see it's the same way. We have filters in the top left, columns in the top right, rows in the bottom left, and values in the bottom right. And it lays out exactly the same way. And then we have our pivot table field list, you can see with the red square there. Those are all of the fields that are available to us. Now, before we get into our demonstration and start building this out, we're going to spend the bulk of our time in Excel. I do want to share with you a secret to building any pivot table or any report faster, and that is start with an end in mind. Draw it out on paper first. And it doesn't have to be fancy. This is a variation of one of the things that I wrote. Oh, we're going to build this out. And this is my horrible handwriting, but you can see it's written on a piece of paper. So I'm like, I want to see posted unpaid invoices with vendors in the rows, and then the columns I want to see what's due this week, what's due next week, what's due in 2 weeks, and then I could see.
Hey, Belinda.
Yeah.
Hey, this is Mike. Sorry to interrupt you. We cannot see your screen. We're still just seeing you.
Really? Oh. Well, that's no good. So let me turn me off, and now you're seeing the wrong screen. There we go.
As much as we love watching you talk.
Now you can see it, right?
There it is. Yep.
All right, so you guys saw me do my little sing song there. So let me go back just to that screen. All right, there are the colors. You saw that, I guess. And then I have the canvas and the fields. All right. So here is, thank you, Mike. That of mine, Mike. So a lot of you might have talked to Mike if you've ever come to any of their trade shows or called our company. He's the head of our sales team. He's pretty awesome. Anyhow, all right. So this is my little drawing, and this is an idea. It doesn't have to be exact, but if you start with an idea of what you want, you could vary from it, and you could then start doing your analysis. But trust me, if you try to invent at the keyboard, it's going to take you a lot longer. And I don't know why I'm still staring at the camera while I'm talking. I guess I'm crazy. Now, for those of you who use GP, bear with me for just a brief moment here. When I got this data, I used Smart List, but I would recommend you use the Excel refreshable reports to build this out. And if you wanted to go into Smart List, 2 things I did. One of them in the search, I set it to 1 billion records so that I would make sure and get everything. And then I added 4 columns. You can see them on the left. I added originating master ID and master name so that if it comes from something like Payables, you can see the vendor ID and the vendor name. I added source document, which is part of a general ledger entry, so I can tell where the originating source of that transaction was. And I added the main account segment just in case I wanted to use that. So let's go ahead. I'm going to end this slideshow and open up my first data report. And I know you see a blue screen. I'm pulling it up now. There we go. All right. All right, so this is the general ledger data that I've extracted out. Pull out the dates there. And right now it's just in an Excel file. So depending on what version of GP you have, if you're a GP user, you may or may not export from SmartList data into a table. If you want to get into a table, it's super simple, and I'm going to talk about why tables are important in just a moment. Right from the Home tab in Excel, there is an option, Format as Table. And so I'm going to go ahead and just format this as a table. And it automatically selects everything has touching ranges, so it'll get everything. And I have a table header, so there's a row that indicates the header. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Now, the reason why I like to use tables when I do this has to do with the fact that if I create a formula or a function, then when I refresh the data, if I use a refreshable report, it's going to automatically copy that formula for all new function or all new rows. So for example, I have debits and credits here. I'm going to just insert a column right here. And I want to get the net between those. So I'll create the column name called net. And when I start to do my formula equals debit amount, you're going to notice that, pull up. Well, I just lost my whole report there. What did I do? I was trying, there we go. I was trying to get my zoom in. Linda's having all kinds of issues. Okay, so you could see that when I selected that cell, I actually selected cell G2, but instead of putting the cell name, it put in the column name. And that way, that's how it knows, oh, this is something that we'll definitely want to keep repeating this formula as we go along. So what I'm going to do is, let me delete both of those out so that it'll do it all over again since I've messed that up. I'll do a debit minus credit. And you'll see it happen in a bit. And then it'll copy that formula down. And for every row, it's going to say the column name instead of the cell name. So that as I refresh, it's going to automatically refresh as well. Now, while I'm in here, since this is a table now, I have a table tools option and a new ribbon available. And what a table does is it turns into a bit of a database where every row represents a single record. And I know you might be thinking Excel does that anyhow, but you could put an account number in row 1 and then all the transactions in 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then the next account number in row 6. But in a table, it's always going to have, each row is going to represent one complete record. Now up here in the top left, it has the table name. Right now it's just called table name. I can change this to GL transactions. So now when I reference this table, I can reference just GL transactions. And I could either summarize with a pivot table here or click on insert. And since I'm right in the pivot table, choose pivot table again. It recognizes the table that I was on. And there's that table name I just created. I'll add it to a new worksheet and I'll click OK. So now here I am in the same kind of screen we saw on my slide deck with the pivot table canvas on the left and all the pivot table fields on the right with my 4 components: filters, columns, rows, and values. And now all I have to do is begin populating. Now in this one, what I'm going to do is grab the originating master name into rows, and there are all my rows. That's how quick and easy that is. And now I'm going to take that net amount and drag it into values. Now, you can see this is looking a bit weird. It is because it's not sure how to format this. So what I'm going to do, over here in values, I'm going to choose the drop-down list and choose value field settings. And I'll try not to move around too much on this so you don't feel like you're getting drunk. Now, the name here has to be unique. There's already a net column, but if I make this net space, that technically will make it a unique column name. And now I could go to show format, change this to currency, and if it's negative, I'll make it appear as red and click OK, and OK again. And now the column is called net, and all of the balances have a number there. Now, some of you might be thinking, why are all the numbers 0? I saw values. And that's because I'm looking at general ledger data. And in general ledger, debits equal credits, or at least they should. And so for each vendor, it should be 0 for us. So one of the things we might want to do is think about the account numbers that are being used. So what I'm going to do is come over here and take the account number on the pivot table field list, and I'm going to drag it below originating master name. And now you can see for each vendor, I can see the GL accounts that vendor affected and the balances of them. So I can kind of monitor what's going on. Now, if I do not want cash or AP accounts, so I only want to see, because every vendor is going to have an effect on cash and AP, but I want to see all of the other ones so that it doesn't balance 0, and I can see the true effect of what a vendor has on our company, or at least on our accounts. What I could do is on this row label, I'm going to click on one of the account numbers so that when I use this filter, I'm filtering on the account number and not the vendor ID. So if I click on the drop-down list, I can now see all of my accounts here, and I can unmark the ones I do not want. Like I do not want, this is my cash account, I happen to know that, and this is my AP account. So I'm going to click OK, and now I can see the effect that this particular vendor has on our account, on our company. So I can monitor exactly what's going on. Now I'm going to come back in here for a moment, and I'm going to take the account number and drag it back on above rows. And now for each account number I can see. So this is an example of how easy it would be in a meeting if someone said, like this is, let me scroll down past some liability accounts. So this particular account right here, 4720. If I'm looking at this and we're like, okay, who did we have transactions posted for here? I could look that way. And then if I wanted to see what other accounts Capital Printed Circuits used, I could do that. Now, I don't know what account number 4720 is, but I could take that account description name and drag it below account number. And now if I were to go back to 4720, I can see that's international freight and handling. Now, as I'm looking at the account like this is one of the things some people struggle with. This is a little awkward to read. This is not my preferred method, and actually there's a couple of Excel MVPs leading the charge to not make this particular outline format the default. What you could do, when you're in a pivot table, there are 2 new menu options. One is Analyze and one is Design, and they're under the Pivot Tables tool area. If I were to go, and this is the Analyze one that we're up on now, if I were to go to Design, I can come up to Report Layouts, and I could tell it to show it in a tabular format. And now I had 3 items in rows. I can now see those 3 individual items listed. I should have stretched that one out. I can see the 3 individual row columns each have their own column in this spreadsheet, in this pivot table. Now, it's still a bit junky because if we look here, we can see this is the total of petty cash, this is the total of the account number, and those are actually the same thing. So what I also might want to do is click on subtotal and click on do not show subtotal. And now my report is much more concise, and I can see how that works. Now, if I wanted to see a grand total for petty cash in general or whatever account's being used, I have a couple ways I can do this. First of all, you can see the account number and the account description both have that minus sign. So those are outlined still. And I could just click on the minus and I could collapse that down and see the total. And if I want to open it back up, I can do it that way. I could also right mouse click there, choose expand collapse and either expand collapse one at a time or do the entire field. So I'm going to collapse the entire field. So now I have a summary report. On the pivot table tools on the Analyze tab, there's also an expand and collapse entire field there. So those are three different ways that we can alter how this report works for us. And so we go from looking at this detail to looking at it in summary. Very quick and easy. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take the account description off, and I'm going to put the account name or the vendor name back before the account number. So we're looking at it in this format instead. And again, if I wanted to collapse, I could still see that information as well. All right, so what I'm going to do, let's add in a column element. I'm going to grab source document and drag it into columns. And as soon as I do that, the columns are going to start breaking down depending on their source document. Now, this is something specific to GP. It's like PM check, PM apply, and so forth. I'm interested in just maybe invoices, so I want to see just PM TRX. So what I could do is come up to the filter for the source document, and I could tell it I just want to see payables transaction entry. And so now I see the payables transaction, and I have this grand total here too, which probably doesn't offer me a whole lot of value. So if I were to come back up to design and go to grand totals, I could tell it turn it on for rows only or for columns only. So I'm going to turn it on for columns only. So it gets rid of that row one, but down at the bottom I'll still have a grand total. And that's how that one would work. So those are some ways you might want to turn those on sometimes, turn them off sometimes. You can have some control on how you want to do that. Now we have filters. And I'm going to do something a little bit fun on filters. We want to filter the whole report. Now all the data, we're not filtering the data itself. The state data still have everything, but what we're seeing on the pivot table we want to filter. And I've already filter the columns down to just payables transactions. So I want to change that to the report instead. So over here in the pivot table field list, I'm just going to drag it from columns to filters. It remembers that filter I put in, and if I click on it now, I still see all of those options. And so now I just have this one column, and I have, I can change it and look at checks and all of the other, whatever else I may have there. All right, so that's pretty cool. I think it's pretty cool anyhow. All right, so let's see. Another thing we might want to do is we might want to do some filters by years. So let's talk about that. I'm going to go into the account transaction, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a year column. So I'll just do an insert here, or I'm in the data. I'll do a year, and the formula is just a year. You guys probably know how to do this. Now in a table, one of the things, since I inserted right after the account transaction, it formatted it as if that was the date. So it's looking for the 218th day and whatever Excel calculations that would be. I'm going to just right mouse this whole column and format it to a number with no decimal places and no comma separators. And now I have my year. If I go back to my pivot table, I could either go to data and refresh, or I can go to analyze and refresh. And now I'll have my year formula, and I could drag my year into the columns. Another thing I can do is on the pivot table, come up and insert a slicer or timeline, whichever way I want it to do it. And I could put the year in there. So that's one way to put the year in. Now, the year will often have some dim things, if a slicer will often have something dimmed out of it, because I filtered somewhere else. I might have filtered out all of the 2020 data. So what I could do to fix this, you'll notice now that my handlebars are around the slicer, I have a slicer tool option. If I come up and go to slicer settings, I want to tell it to hide items with no data. And now the slicer will only represent data for years that I have data. So if I want to look at 2018, I could see it that way. Another way I could have done it would have been under Analyze to use a timeline slicer. There's only one date. So on the timeline slicer, I can narrow this down from months to years this way, and then I could have selected the years like this as well, or stretch across 2 years, whichever one I want to do. Now, before I finish that out, what I'd like to do here, actually, let me get rid of this here. What I'd like to do here is I want to, let's see, I want to take out the year out of the columns, and I want to take that transaction date and put it in the columns. Now, depending on the version of Excel you have, you might see the years from those dates, or you might actually see the date itself. If you see the years, that's because in later versions of Excel, it does automatic grouping. I'm going to just click on this year, right mouse click, and ungroup. And now I just see transaction date here, and I can see all of the transaction dates that are represented with whatever filters I have turned on. If I want to turn them back into years, I could right mouse click and choose group again. And I don't have to use years. I could change it to quarters of n years if I want. I could do more than one. And if I do that, I see the year and I see the quarters in each one, and I could collapse them. Here's one with 2 quarters by just clicking on the collapse there. And you'll notice that down here then in the columns, I see whatever is visible there. So I see like the topmost one, I see years, and I see the document date. So those are some different ways that we can manage those. So that's pretty nifty. Let me get rid of those. All right, so we've got the years here, and we've got the account number. And all right, you know what? I'll show you the chart in the next one. So let me open up one more. This time we're going to look at payables from the payables perspective. There we go. Same thing that I'm pulling data out of GP. And again, it doesn't really matter which one that you're using. And forgive me, I did not include the vendor name on this report, but that's okay. There's a couple things here, though, that I want to talk about. When you are looking at report with data, you always want to be conscious of the fact that your system will probably include voided transactions because that's part of history. So you want to make sure that you're either accessing a view in SQL where voids are automatically excluded, or you want to include it in your formula so you could filter out voids. And in this case, I also included posted transactions, and I also included the vendor status. If you have a hold option, you might want to include vendor holds. It's a great way to see what transactions are on hold or what vendors are on hold. In the case of GP, both of those can happen independently or simultaneously. So we've got all of that. Now, another thing I want to point out, depending on how your database is stored, payments, returns, credit memos, anything that reduces the vendor balance may show up as a positive number. And in the case of GP, that's certainly the case. That's because it just stores the transaction itself. So I want to make sure that I put in a formula that reverses the sign if it needs to be reversed. In the case of GP, there's also document date and current transaction amount. Current transaction amount is the amount I owe, not the amount of the document. So if I had a $100 invoice and I paid $50, my document amount would be 100, my current transaction would be 50. So what I'm going to do, well, first of all, let's turn this into a table. And by the way, if you want to not make this a table, all you have to do on the table tool option is click on convert to range, and it'll go back to a normal range. That's not a table. It's not going to act like a table. But you could come back in and put the table filter back on. All right, so got the table there. So what I'm going to do is insert a new column here, and we'll call this amount due. And this is going to be the most complicated thing that I am going to do on this. All right, this is going to be the hardest thing, right? And it's not hard at all. So first thing I want to do is I've got payments. Let's look at all the type. Payments, returns, and credit memos, and mine are set to credit. And you want to keep in mind when you're looking at these, like payment here, you might want to look at them and copy the word because there might be blank spaces at the end of it. And it might be different depending on which database you're looking at. In the case of GP, if you could pull out the integer that represents it, like 1 is the invoice, and 9, I think, is a scheduled payment, whatever the case may be, then that makes it a little bit easier as well. So there are only, in the world of GP, there are only 3 transaction types that make the balance negative. So I'm going to do those because there are 4 that make balances positive, so increase, so I'm going to use the negative one. So what I'm going to do is come up to formulas and do a logical if. Oop, that's an if error. Let's do it again. Logical if. And I'm going to say if the amount in the current transaction, or the current transaction amount column, if, whoops, wrong field. That's not a good way to start. If the document type is equal to, and then double quotes because it's a string, I'm going to put in the word payment. If it's a payment, you can see on the first row it is not, it's an invoice. If it is a payment, then I'm going to put a minus and the current transaction amount. So it'll put a negative version of that amount. Otherwise, I'll put the positive amount. And I'm going to click OK. And you can see it populates these fields. Now, if I were to come in here and I were to come in and just say payment, I'm going to see on the amount due, there are only negatives or zeros. And that's the way I want it to be. So let's come back over here and set this to everything. And then now what I'm going to do is copy all of that. I'm going to nest this in itself. Let me turn on my zoom if I can. And what I'm going to do here, so I'm going to get rid of that last part, which is the false column, and I'll paste everything in, and I'm going to call this credit. So if it's credit, it's also 0. And then once again, get rid of that last option. And this one was return. So now my formula reads, if the document type is payment, make the current transaction amount negative. If it's not payment, is the document type credit? If it is, make it negative. If it's not credit either, then is it a return? If it is, make it negative. Otherwise, it must be a positive one. So I'm going to paste that in. So now if I were to just look at invoices, I'm only going to see positive amounts. And if I look at everything else but invoices, I'm only going to see negative amounts. And that's part of my table. And again, if you do a custom view, that's going to be a lot easier on you. Or also, if you make it, use one of the Excel refresher reports to build this out, then you only have to do this one time. It makes life a lot easier. That is the most complicated thing that I have to show you there. So that's pretty simple. So now that we have that done, let's come in and insert a pivot table. And I didn't name this one, so it just says table 2. And so what we're going to do is we're going to put the vendor ID into the rows. And I'm going to take that new amount due column, there it is, and drag it into values. So now I can see how much we owe each and every vendor. So that's pretty cool. Let's take it a step further. Let's clean this up a little bit. I'm going to right mouse click on one of the amount fields, choose the value field settings, and let's make this amount due. Whoops, forgot that space at the end to make it unique. Let's go to number format and set this to currency. So now we only see vendors in which we owe money to. Now, there's a lot that have 0, and I don't want those to show, because if I only want to see who I owe money to, then I don't want to see anyone that has a 0 balance. So what I'm going to do under row label is click on that filter, and we go to the value filter here, and I could say does not equal 0, and I'll click OK, and now I don't see anyone with the 0. Also, in that same filter option, I could sort the vendors alphabetically, reverse alphabetically, or I could come into more sort options, and I could tell it that I want to sort them descending, not by the vendor ID, but by the amount due, which is one of my columns here, or my values. So now I can see who I owe the most money to at the very top. If I'm only interested in like the top X% or the top 10 vendors, I can once again click on that option, and I could go to the value filters, and one of the options is top in. And I could either say the top or the bottom, I could reset the number. I'll choose the top 8, items, percent, or the sum, and then again of the amount. So now I just see the top 8 vendors with whom I owe money to. Let me change this to top 20. Yep, make it top 12. All right. I want to have a little bit more stuff out there for when I go down a little bit later. All right, so that's pretty cool. Now, remember, I want to basically get like a due date report. So what I'm going to do, I didn't bring in the due date. Normally, you would want to do that. So what I'm going to do is just insert another column here. I'm going to call this one due date. And I'm going to say grab the document date plus 30 days. And once again, because this is a table, anytime I refresh and get more data or less data, the formula for that's going to copy down. So if I go back to my pivot table and I have to refresh to get my due date there, now I have my due date. And I'm going to drag that due date into the columns like we did before. And once again, it formatted or grouped them together by date. What I want to do is ungroup them for this example. And now you could see, all right, I'm looking all the way across. I'm like, wow, I'm seeing every single due date. Well, I really wanted to know like this week, and I don't know if I have anything due this week or not, so we're going to do it by year. But if I highlight this date and I click on this filter, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say, see where it says date filters? That's something different. When I was on the row format for the vendor, I had a label where I could have put in like all the vendors that start with the letter F, for example. If I go to date filter, I could say today, before today. I could narrow down all kinds of different options there. I'm going to grab last year as an example. So now I'm only looking at items for last year. And what I want to do now is I'm going to right mouse click here and group these together by months. And now I could see them grouped by month. So I'm looking at everything that I owed for last year. If I wanted to sort this by weeks, for example, I could do that as well. So I could come in here. So in theory, you could put in a filter that says just this year and just this month, or a slicer or a timeline slicer that shows for just this month. And if I come in here under the date filters, another option I have is I could do, oh, actually, wrong area. There we go. I'm going to highlight this January. Right mouse click there. Sorry, that's where I right mouse click, group. Here's where I meant to do this. And I'm going to choose by day, group by day. And I can put in by 7 days. I'm going to put in 45 days. Probably not a good idea. Let me do 15 days. And I'll click OK. And now these are grouped by like 2-week periods. So that easily I created something very similar to what I had on my sheet by just grouping into 2-week periods. So I think that's pretty cool, being able to do that. I'm going to take the due date out and put the year back in. Oh, I didn't get the year. So let me just put in the transaction date, the document date again, and it'll be sorted by year for me. And if I only want it to be sorted by year, I can click over here on the columns for the quarters and remove that field, and then remove the transaction field, just leave the years out there. And now I have it sorted by years. So I didn't have to actually create a column to sort by years in order to be able to do that. All right, I love this feature. Okay, so before we move on, what I'm going to do, first of all, a lot of people don't know you could even do this. I'm going to copy, just highlight this whole pivot table, and I'm going to add a new sheet and paste that in. And so now I have a version of this pivot table out there for me. Guess I gotta stretch all these out one at a time. And okay, so let's go back to the first pivot table that we have here. So another thing I want to do before I move on is add a chart to this. So I have this selected. I'm going to come up to the Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab, and I'm going to choose to add a pivot chart. And you could add one of quite a few charts right out of the box. Not a fan of the, personally, not a fan of the, let me get rid of this and add this over on the side, of the pie chart. So we're not going to use that. Let me shrink that up a bit. Okay, a little bit more. All right, so to the right of the chart here, there's a plus sign, so you could decide which elements you want to see and which ones you do not want to see right here on the spot. All right, so that's pretty cool, being able to see that. Let me come in and add a slicer in here. So I'm going to come in and add a slicer. Let's put a slicer in for the years. Now that I created that year option and got that done, let's set that slicer option so that we only see what's available there. So that's pretty cool. And let's add a slicer in for the document type. Why not? So we'll add another slicer there for the document type. And I could see I did not remember to put in my filter for my void. So let me do that real fast. So under Analyze, I'm going to add the field list back. I'm going to take that void status, put it in the filter there, so I can filter on those. So now I don't see any of my void options. All right. And on this slicer, let's hide also items with no value. Now I want to show you how interactive this is. So this is pretty cool. So let's say, actually let me drag these over here. Let's say instead of looking at the top 10, so I'm going to come back in, go to the top 10 and I'll do it again. And I want to remove that filter. Let's do it this way, percent 100, that ought to show me everything. All right, so there are all my vendors. You can see that automatically changed the report as we did that. Let's go back. I'm going to click on the vendor name, our vendor ID. Let's come back into this label filter and we'll say begins with the F. Why not? And now all of a sudden we see just vendors that start with an F. And doesn't look like we have anything for those, so let's change that filter to begins with an A. I know I have quite a few A's. All right, so the report changes automatically as we go along. You can see it altering. If I were to click and say just show me invoices or payments or returns, you could see everything being selected based on that. If I go to 2018, the pivot table changes, the chart changes, and so forth. Furthermore, what we could do here, I could look at the pivot table list itself here, and I could come in, I could clear the filters for all the vendors, and then come back in and say, I only want to see the top 10% by amount due, and that happens to be 2. So regardless of whether you work from the pivot table, the slicers, or the chart, they're all going to be interactive. Now, let me come through here. I want to make sure that we're looking at everything. I'm going to go into this other sheet. Now I'm going to show you, before I show you those, let me pull up my slideshow again, because I do want to show if you pull from SmartList, for example, you do want to make sure that you are getting the current transaction type, voided, the vendor status, posted, and you want to make sure that you have the document type, because that's essential, because you're going to need to know how to make it debit or credit. So I want to keep that in mind. All right, so now I want to show you some more of these pivot table secrets that I think are super duper cool. All right, so we are looking at our vendors and we have the columns across and we have the amounts of the actual amounts that was spent in here. Let's go back in and turn on our pivot table field list. Because I forgot to exclude voids, let's go ahead and exclude voids. So we'll set that to no. And let's go ahead and make sure we're only looking at posted transactions. So I'm going to come in here, and in the case of GP, it's either posted at no, or if it's posted, it's blank. So I'm going to unmark no and leave the blank posted. All right. So now we're looking at just posted transactions that are not voided. All right. Very good. So let's go back to our table for a moment. I want to go ahead for this example. I'm going to add 2 columns here. One of them will be year, similar to what we did before. And this one gets calculated just the same. Year and grab the year. Got to format that so that it is getting the year properly. So that would be a number, no decimals, no commas. And in this one, I'm going to grab just the month name. So call this month. And in this is actually a text formula. And the value will get the month name from the document date. And then I'll put in a comma. Let me put in a comma. And then I'll tell it how I want it to appear. It's going to be text, so I'll do the double quotes. I'll put in 4 M's, ending double quote, and ending parentheses. And now you can see I have the month, full month name. And if I want just the 3 digits of the months, I'll put in 3 big M's, and now I just see the month. All right. So now I have the month, the year. So let's go back to that spreadsheet. Let's refresh our pivot table fields. So now I have those. All right. So what we're going to do, I've got the, actually, I'm going to get rid of the vendor ID and put the month in the rows. The amount due will leave set as this. And actually for this case, I'm going to just remove those filters. So we'll just pretend that those are fine. I'm going to drag the document type and put it in there. So here we go. We can see, actually, let's put in, we'll put in the year. So we could see month to month, year over year, and so forth. All right. So what I want to do now is I want to, instead of looking at the actual amount, I want to see how each month changed for the balance changed over month, year over year. So what I'm going to do is click on one of these values, right mouse click, and I'm going to change it from, you could also see I could count the number of transactions there, but I'm going to change it to show values as, and one of them is difference from. So the base field is the month, and the base item will be the previous month. And I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. And there we go. So this is looking at it just from year to year, but I could see the change that occurs month over month, right? So, oh, this is going across. So I got this the wrong way. So let me see if I can get it to work that way. You know what? You should always do things the way you had intended. Otherwise, you're going to be all messed up. There we go. So now you can see the change over change that's occurring in each of these documents month by month. So this is really a bad example, but a lot of people don't know that you could do a month change from the other month change. You could even do it based on a percentage. So you could see how the balance of an account is changing, how sales are changing, and so forth. A lot of people don't know that you could do that. So that's pretty cool. All right. Let's see. We've got that done. And let's come back in and reset this to no calculation. So we're looking at just the balances. All right, cool. And I'm going to take, I want to get the days past due. So I need to add another formula in here. I'm going to come in and I've got this due date here. And I'm going to add in days past due. So I want to get an actual number here. So I'm going to go in and say the due date, should be today. Today, and you could do this without having to have a due date in there. I could have just, instead of doing today minus this due date field, I could have done today minus the document plus 30. All right, but this works just as well. There we go. So let's format this as a whole number. So now I can see the days too, and this is crazy data, so just ignore it. So now I have the days past due, and I want to create basically something akin to an age trial balance in doing this. And so what I'm going to do is, let me take out the document type and put in vendor ID right there. Put month across. Nope, don't want month across. I will leave it like that. I'll just leave vendor in the filter. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to take the days due, days past due, and actually, you know what? Let me put my month in the filter for right now too. And so what I could do on the days past due, this only works with a number. I'm going to right mouse click on it, and I am going to group this together. And I've got this, it has a starting and an ending, and it's right now it's grouped by 100. Let me change it to group by 500, so there won't be a whole lot of them, and I'll click OK. And now you could see it has grouped, and I just did a mark through. Let me undo that. Okay, so now it has grouped these together as if like 0 to 30 days, 30 to 60, and so forth, based on the days that are in there. So you could create this independent aging outside of your accounting system right here on the spot. And so now that we have that done, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the month, or actually I'm going to grab the vendor and put it back in, and I'm going to put that days past due in the columns, and now it remains in the column. So for each vendor, I can see the document.
Hey, Belinda, it's Mike again. I think we may have lost your audio.
Oh, you lost my audio?
Oh, now you're back.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry about that. Okay, thank you, Mike. All right, so down here at the bottom, you notice I have sheet 1, sheet 2, and then my payables transactions. So let's actually get rid of sheet 1, just so you can see this in action. So all I have are those two. I'm going to go up to the top. I have vendor and month in my options here. Now what I want to show you is, let me click on the pivot table, and I'm going to go to Analyze. When you have a filter and you're in this pivot table Analyze, this option has an arrow. Anywhere you see an arrow in an Excel or Word or any Microsoft application, there's a drop-down menu that will appear there. And one of the things that you will see only if you have a filter in place and you click on this arrow is the Show Report Filters page. So I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to turn off my zoom. You could see here, that makes it easier to see, it's looking at the two things that are in my filter, by month or by vendor ID. So I'm going to select by vendor ID, and I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And I want you to notice what's going to happen to my window here. And it's taking a few seconds there. It's actually created a separate tab for each and every vendor using that particular layout of the pivot table. Now you can't undo this, and with the new Excel there's that auto save on. So if you do want to do this, you'll want to, as soon as you get your pivot table set the way you want, you'll want to do a file save as, and then once you do the file save as, then you can sit and do this. And right now I didn't exclude zeros, so I'm getting a lot with zeros. But for every single vendor, I'm getting a unique pivot table that shows me that information filtered to just that vendor. That's probably one of the coolest things you could do. And you could do it super fast and super easy. That quickly, I created basically 100 different reports right on the spot. So let's go back to our slide deck. I do have one more poll question I want to ask, but this is for me. Hopefully you guys learned something new today and are willing to answer the question. All right. So far, nobody has said no. So I'm going to turn off the poll question before somebody says, no, I didn't learn anything new. So that was selfish. Thank you for that. Now, as a result, I do have a slide deck or an Excel sheet that has all of my demo scripts or things that I was supposed to show you in the order I was supposed to show you. And I have these sample Excel files. If you would like a copy of them, then in the chat, if you would, either in the chat or the questions, you could just write, send me files or something to that effect. And after the webinar, I will send you a copy of the slide deck in PDF form. I'll send you the Excel sheet that has my script on it, and I'll show you what it looks like so you can get a feel for it. So you could see these, it has all the steps in there, what I was supposed to be doing. And then I could send you the sample files that you can use to build this out yourself if you're one of that. So just click on send me files. I'll be glad to do that. Also, if you have a topic in mind of something you'd like to see a webinar of, please write it in the topic request. I'm not saying we'll absolutely do it, but we are always hungry for ideas of things to show. So by all means, put any kind of topic idea you have in the webinar request. And so Brandon, it does, I guess there's, were there any questions that I should be?
No, just file a request from what I see.
Okay. Yeah, and Belinda, stay consistent. I don't know what, occasionally my internet's a little nutty, and obviously I was nutty on logging in, so I don't know. I think it has something to do with the way I logged in, because I can't seem to write anything in the questions pane. All I could do is recopy what Denise wrote to me at the very beginning. So, all right. That being said, this will draw this session to a conclusion. This and all of our other webinars can be found at our Ingevity site. So I think Mike would be really happy if I mentioned that. So I'll show you where you can get those. If you go to ingevity.com, under events, we have upcoming ones. So next week, we're going to be doing a repeat. These are mountain times, keep that in mind, of some of our favorite Excel shootout demonstrations. So I'll be joined by my dear friends, Mark Lino and Sean Dord, and Pam Michelik. Our lovely, my lovely team leader will be on as well. And then 2 weeks from now, there's going to be a custom a session on specific to GP on how to connect to data in GP inside of Power BI and how you create relationships. But down below we have the training library, and here's where you'll be able to find the better reporting area. So you'll be able to see the recording in there. Beyond that, I want to thank everybody for attending, and I hope all of you have a wonderful and healthy and happy year ahead. Thanks.